They said it wasn't humanly possible. All the power and excitement of Nintendo right in the palm of your hand.
The Game Boy, one of the greatest inventions known to mankind. So good, in fact, that Nintendo didn't really feel the need to upgrade it very much for over a decade. There was the Pocket and there was the Color, sure, but essentially the power was more or less the same for that entire period. That is until the early 2000s when Nintendo finally decided that they would advance the Game Boy by making the Game Boy Advance. I had a lot of good memories with the Game Boy Advance. I had the original purple one, kind of like this purple, like this Switch light here, but I played that thing a lot, and it still wasn't backlit, which is crazy to remember. It's funny that all of my memories playing that thing are in the bathroom. There was just like perfect lighting right above the toilet, so I would sit in the bathroom and play my GBA, and I just remember playing games like Golden Sun, Pokemon Sapphire, and a bunch of Yu-Gi-Oh games. Eventually I traded in my GBA for a copy of Fable. Whatever ridicule you have for me, it's well deserved. And yeah, I never had a Game Boy Advance SP growing up, though I always wanted one. I had a backlight for the first time ever. It was really cool, but I never got one. But now, I don't need one, because the next best thing has landed right in my lap. As in, it was shipped to me. And it's this guy right here, the RG35XXSP by Anbernic. Tell me that's not the coolest name that you've ever heard. This rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? And here it is in all its glory, the RG35XXSP. Now this review is a little bit late. This thing's been out for a couple months, but I think it's something that's still worth talking about. I mean, the rate these things come out and the rate at which I put out videos, I mean, did you expect I would put anything out sooner? Joking aside, if you're looking at this as an option for a handheld emulator, there is a lot to like here, but it is not all perfect. However, I would say this is probably one of my favorite emulation devices that I've used. It retails for $64.99, starting with a 64GB SD card included, which has your OS and some games that will be included. You've got black transparent, silver, gray, and the blue transparent, which is what I have here. Now, a lot of people who are nostalgic for the Game Boy Advance SP will probably go for the silver option because of the silver Game Boy Advance SP back in the day, but since I never had one, the blue one called my name, and I think it looks great. How could you resist this nice transparent blue? If you're familiar with any of the RG35XX Plus devices, as in the H, aka the Honcho, the 28XX, the 40XX, and so on, this device is going to be very familiar as far as internals. It's got the same OS and the same internals and everything as those devices. It's got this 3.5-inch IPS display, which looks very nice. It's 640 by 480, and that is going to be a great resolution for the games you're going to play on this thing, especially with a 3.5-inch screen. It's got a H700 quad-core processor, 1GB of LPDDR4 RAM. You've got your shoulder buttons here on top, which do rattle, unfortunately. It's not a huge deal, like I'm not running around shaking this thing like a maraca, but if rattly shoulder buttons bother you, they do rattle, but I have definitely heard worse. You've also got a USB port here along the top, a mini HDMI port. On the bottom, you've got a headphone jack and the two SD card slots, one for the OS and one for your additional games if you decide to use two SD cards. You can just put games on the one SD card, which is how it comes out of the box anyway. You've also got a volume rocker on one side and a power and reset button on the other. On the front, you've got start and select, your D-pad, your face buttons, and the menu button. The menu button can be used in a variety of ways out of the box for shortcuts in RetroArch, such as fast forwarding games, loading state, saving state, and so on. It's a very useful button, does lots of cool things. If you're one of those folks who wants to use a device as is out of the box without doing any custom firmware or flashing of a new SD card, this is probably one of the best devices to do that. First of all, the SD card. People always say to replace the stock SD card that comes with these things. This one comes with an SD card from Kioxia, however you say this, and from what I understand, that is actually Toshiba, which is a pretty reliable brand. I've had a couple devices that came with this, and from what I've heard, they actually are pretty decent. You could still get away with using these for a longer term than you would with a generic SD card that usually comes with these things. I've been using this off and on for a couple months, and so far the SD card has held up just fine. If you've seen my review of the RG35XXH, the home screen here is a bit different, a bit updated. You've got your game room section, RA game, which is RetroArch, your favorites, history, search, app center, and settings. Game rooms is sort of that first tab where you're going to be tempted to select it because it's first, and if you open it, it's got all these different games and emulators you can choose from. Don't use game rooms. Whatever you do, don't use the game room tab. Always use the RA game tab. I've always heard this, but was never certain why, and it just turns out that the performance in the game rooms version of a lot of these games is not very good. Aspect ratio is off, some of the games might look worse, and some of the games will even perform worse. Even Game Boy games, like you see here, perform noticeably worse, and we're talking basic Game Boy. I'm filming this on my camera at 24 frames per second, so it's going to be probably harder to tell to the naked eye. But in person, believe me, it kind of looks playable on the basic Game Rooms version, but the second I jump to the RA version, it is night and day difference. It is much smoother on the RA version. Plus, it just looks like a completely different game. It looks way better. Your favorites tab is pretty self-explanatory. If you favorite a game, it's going to appear here. And the search tab, also pretty self-explanatory. You search for a game you're looking for, and if it's installed, it will pop up here. And if you're looking to catch them all, here's all that you can catch included with this thing. It's not everything, but there's quite a bit here, and I did not add any Pokemon games to this thing, so what you see here is what came with the 64GB version. I know I'm still gonna get questions about that, but I mean, here it is, clear as day. This is what came with the system. If you see games twice, it's because it's got the Game Rooms version and the RetroArch version. Anbernic has a history of omitting games that star a certain plumber, or at least that have a certain plumber in the title. I guess they feel that maybe they can skirt along the lines of any legal repercussions. So if you're looking to play any games that have a certain plumber in them, you're gonna have to source the ROMs yourself. Now the App Center is interesting. You've got a music player and a video player, so you can put MP3s on this thing as well as video files if you want to use this as sort of an all-in-one device for your different types of media. There's even an ebook section, so if you want to put ebooks on here, knock yourself out. There's a file manager and an expert mode, which I don't know what it does because I'm not an expert and I don't want to play around with that. And then you have your App Center, where if you go in here, you've got all kinds of different little background options for little things that you can turn off and on. You would think these would be in the settings section, but they're not. They're here in the App Center. And I would recommend going in here and looking at different functions that you want to turn off or on. If that LED light bothers you, you can turn it off. One thing I decided to toggle on was the quick shutdown setting. I set it so that when I close the device, it will shut down completely, and if I'm in the middle of the game when I close it, it will save the game so the next time I turn it on, I can just load up the game exactly from where it was when I left off. That is a killer feature to have out of the box. Devices like the Miu Mini Plus and the original RG35XX did not have this feature built in, and it's one of the reasons that people like to use custom firmware like Garlic OS and Onion OS. It's a very handy feature to have, especially for a clamshell device like this where you might be taking it with you on the go. It's comforting to know you can just close this thing and be just fine with your game saving and then continuing where you left off. Now unfortunately, one of the reasons I have this thing shut down when I close it is because if I don't, sometimes the device will stay awake when it's in clamshell mode, and I would go a while without even noticing. Thankfully this one is transparent, so after a while I would see the glow of the screen still running while I have this thing closed, and I'm like, that's not how that works. That's against the rules. Another issue that I've had, unfortunately, is every once in a while I'm in the middle of playing a game, the system will detect that it's been shut, even though it's not because I'm playing the game, and it will go to sleep, or in this case now, shut down. Very annoying, and it seems to happen less and less the more I've used this thing, but yeah, still annoying. From what I've heard in some of my research, there's this little piece right here under the shell next to the select button. Supposedly something there is causing that to happen. You can open up the device and fix it, but I haven't done that so far because it hasn't been a major issue. The buttons are very loud and clicky, not necessarily in a bad way. They're a little bit more stiff and take a little bit more force than I'd like. The D-pad is also like pretty nice. It's very clicky and again still kind of stiff, but it's not bad. Now this thing can play all kinds of different systems. You got Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, Super Nintendo, Arcade, PS1, Dreamcast, DS, N64. You may notice though that this thing does not have a thumbstick, so it's going to be a little bit tricky to play some of the games that would require a thumbstick, like N64 games for example. However, all you have to do is tap the power button on the right, and that will toggle between the D-pad functioning like a thumbstick or a D-pad. It does take a bit of getting used to, and it's no substitute for a real thumbstick, but it actually works pretty okay. Okay, so apparently N64 performance is a little hit and miss. This is Shadows of the Empire. This is my own ROM that I put on here. And yikes. This does also play PSP, but it doesn't play it super well. You're going to want to play some of your lighter PSP games on this thing. As always, I tested out God of War Chains of Olympus because that's just what I do. It's one of the more intensive games to run. And yeah, it didn't go too well. Dreamcast though works great. DS is also pretty okay. With only one screen and no touchscreen, it's not great. You can use an on-screen stylus and there's different controls and whatnot you can set up for that. But for games like Pokemon and whatnot, games that would do pretty well with just the one screen at a time, this is going to be great for something like that. Don't even try to play something like Rhythm Heaven. You're not going to have a good time. The hinge is pretty good. It has a stopping point way back here, so there's no like stepped stopping point if you want to hold it different, but I don't know why you'd want to. The stopping point for the screen is just fine. There's something really cool about this thing. Like I've said, I never had the SP growing up. Playing with this thing now, playing different games, not just Game Boy Advance games, but other types of games on here, just old nostalgic classics from the Super Nintendo and so on. Having that all here on this one device with a nice bright backlit screen that looks incredible. The hardware itself doesn't really awaken a nostalgic feeling for me, but it's a really cool device that I like having around. Its portability, its foldability, I guess, is probably a better word because it's a real word. It just makes it nicer to take on the go without having to worry about a carrying case. You can just throw it in your bag, throw it in your pocket without worrying about your screen getting all scratched up. If you want something that you can take with you on the go that doesn't have a super tiny screen and super tiny uncomfortable buttons, you don't need the most powerful device out there, you're not going on the bus trying to play GameCube games or something. This is a great device, especially for the price. As far as custom firmware goes, there is Newly, which is what I understand a different version of Batocera or something like that. I haven't really looked much into it. There's also MinUI, which I've used on the Powkiddy RGB30. It's very cool, it's very minimalistic, you don't have to worry about things like cover art and whatnot, it's just simple menus, and it works really well, but it is limited, so if you want to play stuff like DS, Dreamcast, PSP, N64, maybe stay away from that one. And then you have MuOS, also known as Mustard OS. From what I understand, that is a more advanced custom firmware, and I'm not very advanced, so I've chosen not to look at that one just yet. Maybe I'll dive into it someday. So that is all I have for you about this little guy, the Anbernic RG35XXSP. So, and yeah, let me know what you think in the comments. I will have affiliate links to Anbernic's website. I will also have an affiliate link to somewhere in Amazon just for the convenience of the faster shipping, but it is going to cost more through Amazon because that's just how these things go. But if you'd like to support the channel for free, you can do so by liking this video, leaving a comment, subscribing if you're new, tell your friends about this video, tell your friends about the channel, and so on. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm going to get out of here, and it's been a long time since I put out a video because I just needed a little break, and we're going to keep the train a-rolling with like probably 3 or 4 more of these handheld reviews coming as soon as I can get them out. Alright, I'm out of here. Here's some other videos for you guys to watch, and may the sun shine upon your journey across the sands of time. That's what I chose to say at the end of this video.